The currency of fear. Fear was a currency in Harmony Creek, a coin passed hand to hand, its edges worn smooth by the frantic grip of generations. It wasn't the kind of fear you felt watching a scary movie, the delicious shiver that vanished when the lights came up. This was a living thing, a shadow that clung to the corners of your vision, a whisper just beneath the threshold of hearing. It was the fear of a locked door that felt unlocked, of a familiar face suddenly seeming wrong, of the rustle in the cornfields that didn't sound like wind. The feeling was intense, a constant low-humming pressure behind the eyes. It was the tension of a string pulled taut to its breaking point, a state of perpetual anticipation. You could feel it in the air, a static charge that made the hairs on your arms stand up. The intensity was worse at night, when the darkness wasn't just an absence of light, but a presence. The shadows seemed to deepen, to coalesce, to take on substance. Every creak of the floorboards was an intruder's footstep. Every scrape of a branch against the window pane was the claw of something wanting in. It was a siege mentality. People in Harmony Creek locked their doors early and triple-checked them. They drew their curtains tight, not to keep the light out, but to keep the darkness from looking in. The intensity manifested as a collective neurosis, a town-wide case of the jitters. Tempers were short, nerves were frayed. The pressure built with every unexplained event, every whispered rumor, until the entire town felt like a powder keg waiting for a single stray spark. It was undeniably supernatural. There was no other word for it. These weren't pranks or mass hysteria. You couldn't explain away the frost that formed on the inside of windows in July, tracing patterns that looked like screaming faces. You couldn't rationalize the scent of sulfur that would suddenly fill a room, thick and choking, only to vanish moments later. The phenomenon was tied to the land itself, an ancient wrongness that had seeped into the soil. The old-timers spoke of pacts made by the town's founders, deals struck with things that lived in the deep woods and the cold earth. They said the town was a gateway, and sometimes the gate was left ajar. The supernatural wasn't a visitor, it was the landlord. It bent the rules of reality, subtly at first, then with increasing boldness. Compasses would spin uselessly near the old church ruins. Radios would pick up strange rhythmic chanting between stations. It was a slow, deliberate erosion of the known world, replacing it with something older, colder, and utterly indifferent to human sanity. The veil thinned most around Halloween. The one night of the year when the rest of the world played at being scared was the one night Harmony Creek faced its truest self. Halloween wasn't a celebration here, it was an appeasement. The jack-o'-lanterns weren't for fun, they were wards, their jagged smiles meant to mimic and mock the things that walked in the dark, a desperate attempt to blend in. The costumes weren't for treats, they were for camouflage. No one went trick-or-treating after the sun was fully down. The tradition here was different. Families would leave out offerings on their porches, a bowl of milk and honey, a plate of fresh-baked bread, a single perfect apple. It was a tithe, a payment to whatever ruled the night. On Halloween, the whispers from the cornfields grew louder. The shadows in the alleys took on definite shapes, and the feeling of being watched was no longer a feeling, but a certainty. It was the town's annual reckoning, a night of silent, terrified vigil, praying for the dawn. The presence, the core of the town's dread, was evil. Not a petty human evil born of greed or anger, but a primordial evil, ancient and absolute. It was the cold, patient evil of the spider in its web, the silent, implacable evil of the deep ocean. It didn't want to conquer or destroy in a blaze of glory. It wanted to corrupt. It wanted to curdle the good in people, to sour hope into despair, to twist love into obsession. Its influence was a slow poison. It fed on the town's fear, growing stronger with every frightened prayer, every sleepless night. You could feel its malevolence in the way a sudden chill would snake down your spine, in the inexplicable wave of hopelessness that could wash over you on a sunny afternoon. It was a cancer on the soul of the town, hollowing it out from the inside, leaving a perfect-looking shell that was rotten to the core. This evil wasn't loud. It was insidious. It didn't roar, it whispered, and its whispers were the most terrible things of all, because they sounded so much like your own thoughts. And then the clown arrived. It wasn't with a circus. It just appeared. They called her Giggles, not because she laughed, but because you could hear the faint metallic jingle of tiny bells on her costume when the wind was just right. She didn't have a painted smile. Her mouth was a thin, wide gash that seemed to stretch too far across her dead white face. Her eyes were mismatched, one a bright, manic blue, the other a flat, dead black, like a doll's eye. She would just stand, sometimes for hours, at the edge of the playground, or across the street from the general store, or at the end of a lonely lane, perfectly still, holding a single black balloon. She never spoke, she never moved. She just watched. The children stopped playing outside. The adults hurried past, their gazes fixed on the ground. The clown was the town's fear given a face, a form. She was the embodiment of every nightmare, the personification of the wrongness that had always been there, now standing in the open, daring you to look. She brought the freaks with her. Not all at once, but one by one, they trickled into Harmony Creek like dirty water. There was the tall man, impossibly thin and clad in a dusty undertaker's suit, who would walk the streets at midnight, measuring things with a rusted tape. Doorways, fences, graves, people if they were foolish enough to be outside. There was the puppet girl, a childlike creature with joints that seemed to bend the wrong way, her movements jerky and unnatural, her face a blank porcelain mask. Then came the shadow weavers, indistinct figures who were only ever seen at twilight, their forms blurring and stretching as if they weren't entirely solid. They were a court of grotesques, an entourage for the silent clown. They didn't interact with the townsfolk directly, but their presence was a violation. They were a sideshow of horrors, and the entire town of Harmony Creek was their unwilling audience. They were the physical manifestation of the supernatural corruption, the town's inner ugliness made flesh. Their arrival heralded the coming of the circus. It didn't roll into town with bright wagons and cheerful music. It grew. One night, the old fallow field on the edge of town was empty. The next morning, a single vast tent stood there, its canvas the color of a faded bruise, striped with what looked like dried blood. There were no posters, no announcements. The circus simply was. The air around it was thick with the smell of burnt sugar, sawdust, and something else. Something metallic and coppery. At night, strange, discordant music would drift from the tent, a calliope playing a tune that was always slightly off-key, a melody that grated on the nerves and set your teeth on edge. No one went near it, but everyone felt its pull, a morbid curiosity that was almost impossible to resist. The circus tent was a gaping maw on the edge of town, promising wonders and threatening to devour you whole. It was the focal point of all the dread, the grand stage upon which the town's final, terrible act was set to play out. The small town of Harmony Creek had become their cage. The roads leading out seemed longer than they should be. Cars would run out of gas at impossible moments. Phone lines would go dead. The town was cut off, an island in a sea of whispering cornfields. The freaks walked the streets with impunity now, their strange behaviors becoming bolder. The tall man was seen measuring the front door of the mayor's house. The puppet girl was spotted peering into the windows of the school, and Giggles the clown was no longer stationary. She began to move. She would appear on porches, her black balloon bumping softly against the screen door. She would stand in backyards, her head tilted, just watching families eat dinner through their kitchen windows. The small town, once a place of quiet, simmering dread, was now a theatre of overt terror. The boundary between the known and the unknown had been completely erased. The evil was no longer content to whisper from the shadows. It had come out to play. The circus was open for business, and everyone in town had a front-row seat. There would be no encores. There would be no applause. There would only be the show, and then the silence that followed. Smash the like, share, subscribe for more toe-curling tales.